Good afternoon, YouTubers and Facebook friends and people that dwell in the social media realm. This is Jason Dean here at Film Fanatic. If you get a chance, please like and subscribe my page. That is greatly appreciated. I love sharing these videos with everyone out there. I really, it's pretty obvious I have a deep love and passion for all of these films, and they, it goes beyond for me just the source of entertainment. I mean, first and foremost, like I've said many times, probably too many times, but really, I've always loved films as a kid. I was always, I remember seeing my earliest recollections as a kid was seeing, you know, well, my mom is and my father also. They're both like really big Alfred Hitchcock fans, particularly in my for my mom. So it was always a thing. She always loved movies from that era too. She typically liked a lot of the black and white films from that early period of filmmaking from like the 50s and 60s, 40s, 50s. So, and she always had a real attraction to Hitchcock. And I remember as a kid always watching a lot of the black and white films, particularly things that are kind of considered like the film noir films of the 50s. And also, uh, Hitchcock was a big staple in my household growing up as a kid. So my folks always had a big love and appreciation. And so I remember seeing those films when I was a kid, and I was always really enamored with seeing movies on the big screen, or at least in a capacity of being home on television. And then eventually after that, when I got a little bit older, I started to, as the beginning of the VHS age. So that love of films got progressed to get deeper, and then I got into horror films through like the VHS age. Got introduced to Friday the 13th and all of those great movies, all the great slasher films, and that was like a real pivotal thing for me. So I always had a deep love for. I started that was the period where I started developing a real deep love for horror films, and then when I got into college, and I had a couple of friends in school, and then a few friends that I met that were right after school that were like serious videophile guys. Like they were really into particular directors, and they were really into film in general, but more so in the area of horror. And that what was a real big catalyst for me, where I was suddenly around a few friends that were into a lot of the same things, as well as music, where there was a abundance of all kinds of music around, and also being exposed to lots of cool music. But in particular, this was pretty heavily focused on a lot of film. So that really escalated my love for film, and I got introduced during that period. When I was in college, and then shortly after college, but mostly when I was in college. That's when I really got into directors like Akira Kurosawa, famous Japanese director Stanley Kubrick, Martin Scorsese. There were a lot of directors in a lot of films that I had seen over the years that these directors had made. Ridley Scott, what have you, because being exposed to the days of VHS and also things that were on cable. It was also my exposure, when I was a kid, to all of the Hammer horror films that I've talked about, a lot of the horror exploitation movies that I cover. So, but it wasn't until I was in my 20s when I started to like kind of connect the dots with certain films. I'm like, oh, Stanley Kubrick made The Shining, so what else did he make? And then that really sent me down this really cool rabbit hole of where I started to like really check out their, the whole body of work, for instance, that Stanley Kubrick had created while he was alive. and and that made me a big fan. And I did that same kind of thing with multiple directors, and then after college or so, I started buying movies. I started buying DVDs, and there was it's actually still around Opera House Video. I started to buy movies through them, and then I started buying DVDs here and there, and then I started to have a collection. And I started out with about 30 or 40 movies here, as that I had, and then it just kind of grew and grew and grew and grew, and now, you know, the last few years, it's become like a real hobby of mine. I it's in a real big passion with collecting movies, particularly now with Blu-rays. So all of the films that I show on these, with all of these shows, are all films that I pretty much own at this point. I do show movies and talk about films I don't necessarily own, like films that I've seen in the theater or online. For instance, two movies I did that I don't own but I've reviewed is the latest. It came out in July. Jordan Peele's movie Nope, which I thought was a really great, tremendous movie. I'd seen that in the theater. Another really great movie was X. I did a review of that. The Black Phone is another one, another tremendous movie. And then recently I did a show on the new Hellraiser, which I thought was really good overall. And I saw that at a friend's house, and that was online. So I do a lot of movies also. I try to stay current and stay pretty new and fresh, but I try to cover things um, that primarily the channel and kind of my whole way of operating is trying to focus on things that were, maybe under the radar, or films that are being reissued, and what have you. But I try to stay current with a lot of new things. And because it's so broad, there's so many different. I just recently did a show on Martin Scorsese's The King of Comedy, which is a movie I've never seen before, and an amazing movie, just an amazing. And I kicked myself after watching it that I had never seen that film before. Scorsese is another director for me that means a lot. So it's become a passion and a real deep hobby, but it also, for me, want to call if you want to call it that, but artistically, I also use films as a real big, huge inspiration for my creativity, if you want to call it that, particularly around my band Quantum, because that band is really, really influenced by everything that is tied in with films. Whether it's the cinematography, the screenplay, the characterization, the certain kinds of narratives, um, the pacing of certain films, and obviously the music. Basically, everything that goes into making a movie, which is many, many things, many, many aspects on the creative front. All of those things really, really influence me and inspire me in my band Quantum, from how we sound, and how I create the music, and also how we look and how we present ourselves. So it's all of those things are really, really tied in. So over the years, it's become more and more of to a degree, a lifestyle for me. So it's increased my passion. So it's more than just a hobby. So this show, because it's now it's everywhere, and it's kind of the biggest topic right now, that's been going on for a while, as far as uh, related to Halloween. Not only are we approaching Halloween, the great holiday that it is, and it's always, again, since I've been a kid, Halloween has always been my favorite time of year. I uh, always been enamored with all the aesthetics. There's always this kind of running joke or ongoing joke with me and some of my friends or people who know me. Typically, people every year on Halloween, you know, you start seeing, in September or even late August, you start seeing these ads for Halloween candy or masks, or you start, if you're in Walgreens, even in like mid to late August, you'll see candy, Halloween candy, etching up in the aisles, and you're like, wow, okay, it's already that time of year. Like they kind of, like Christmas, it's such a huge money maker, so they kind of push it every year a little bit further or sooner and sooner. And it's Halloween is such a massive holiday. It's like right before it makes almost as much money as Christmas does. It's a very obviously a very consumer driven holiday to a degree. But it's right behind Christmas as far as that huge kind of thing. But for me, I've always loved Halloween as a kid, and this ongoing joke is that typically people will start now everybody who is into Halloween is pretty much decorating. They've decorated their houses already, and pumpkins are out, and all of plans are mostly made as far as what people are going to do or not do on Halloween. Ideas for costumes, but mainly you can see people decorating their houses, and it only comes once a year. But the joke that I have is that my house is basically more or less decorated for Halloween all year round. I've always been fascinated by the darker side of things, and as I've gotten older, I have even a deeper appreciation for those things. So my house is basically decorated in that style year round. So I really, when Halloween actually comes every year, I don't actually need to necessarily decorate or do anything else because my house is already set up to that degree with the things I love and things I decorate my house with masks and what have you. So, and this segues into one of the biggest movies that's been talked about that just came out is as far as I understand, well, it's I haven't seen it, but from what I hear is supposedly the conclusion to the whole franchise is the Halloween uh, franchise, created by the legendary John Carpenter. So, and the latest and supposedly the final installment just came out yesterday or the day before yesterday. Halloween Ends, and it's supposedly the conclusion to this entire franchise. So I figured I would do a little bit of a talk on everything that's kind of related to Halloween. And I've seen every movie except the new one. And again, Halloween was easily the original one in 1978 is easily one of my favorite Halloween movies. It's my favorite movie to watch this time of year. I started watching it last night, and I've seen that movie, a bazillion times, literally. And so the other thing is too is with all the talk and kind of buzz around this movie and whatnot, the I always think, oh, what else can I add to this conversation? And probably not very much, but it means a lot to me. So I figure I'd talk about it, maybe talk about a few things around it, around the franchise, certain films. Try to focus on the original and talk about where I think things have gone, maybe where things have gone in the right direction or possibly in the wrong direction. So, and the idea of franchises, how those seem to function and kind of work in our world right now, because franchises are a regular staple of how we see entertainment now. And with television shows, with the age of television, you have series that run for numerous years, and with franchises now, they'll make 5 to 7 to 10, maybe even more films in particular franchises. But now there's more of them, and it's an abundance. Back when the original Halloween came out, and when Friday 13th came out, and that franchise, there really wasn't a whole lot of those kinds of things happening. So it's a pretty unique time. It can be a little bit tedious or time consuming to get through some of them, but now it's pretty commonplace as far as if a film is a hit, they greenlight and try to not only make a sequel, but I notice now with certain studios they'll greenlight to make 3 or 4 additional films, say like the Marvel films, the Avenger films alone. and what have you. And even with these newer Halloween films, that's been the big case. So I think starting out, I'm going to start off with the one and only 1978 original John Carpenter's Halloween. This movie is one of the most iconic films ever made. And it literally changed the face of horror. And it changed outside of, say, the genre of horror. It definitely changed cinema. But particularly in horror, it definitely changed everything. It was a game changer. And it was, at that time, it was the biggest, it was a very, very low budget, super independent movie. And it made uh, millions and millions of dollars for as little as much as it had taken to make the movie. It set a record and a precedent for how much a small little film could make. And Jamie Lee Curtis, obviously, it was her first role. She's gone on to become a massive actress. Nancy Keiss, Nick Castle played Michael Myers, Donald Pleasance, Samuel Loomis, Dr. Loomis. You know, this movie is one of the most iconic films. I got to see this. Like I said, I've seen this film a bazillion times. Unfortunately, I do not have this on Blu-ray, which is kind of terrible. I have a really great DVD copy that's got a letterbox version of it. Someday I will get it on Blu-ray. I'm not sure why I don't have it on Blu-ray, but I grew up watching this movie, and it always literally scared me. It always gave me the creeps. Particularly the way it's shot. John Carpenter did the music, which is iconic music. Dean Cundon was the cinematographer, and he I think composed some of the greatest scenes ever seen or ever shot in horror in general. Like his lighting and the way he would create this tension with not really a lot of things, but the way where the camera was placed and the masterful lighting just really created this vibe where you really felt these murders and these killings were happening on Halloween, and so it just oozes that kind of that vibe. And I got the chance to see Halloween on the big screen about probably 6 or 7 years ago. There's a really great theater in Rockland, Maine called the Strand, and they do around Halloween time. I think they still do it, but around Halloween time, they usually show a group of kind of horror classics. And the thing that they do, which is really great, is they don't usually show. They'll usually get the original print of the film, so you actually get to see the actual film of the movie. And they had a showing of Halloween, the original one, at the Strand about, like I said, probably 7 years ago now. And it was the original print. It was the original film. And I've seen that movie, even up to that point, a bazillion times. And I swear it was literally like watching it for the first time. It was an amazing experience. It was and I think we saw it. I went with a group of friends. I went with some people that I worked with at the time. We were also friends, but there were a group of us. There was probably like 5 or 6 of us, and only 3 of us had seen it, which was crazy, multiple times. The rest of my friends who I was with had not seen it, and they were considerably younger, but they just had never seen Halloween, and I was just like always baffled by that because they liked horror films and those kinds of things. So I was always surprised. So we went to it, and they saw it for the first time on the screen. I was completely enamored and just blown away by seeing it on the big screen. I mean, it was, for me, it was literally like seeing this film for the first time. I mean, the color and the resolution and the sound, because the Strand is a really magnificent theater, and the sound is amazing. But to see it with the actual film, it was pretty mind blowing, and it was literally like seeing it for the first time. But the funny thing was, the friends that I'd gone had not seen it. They thought it was really dated. They didn't really like they kind of laughed at it. They kind of, ridiculed it, and they were just not really into it. They didn't get it, and it was, I think to a degree, a generational thing. I think they were probably more used to, the quote unquote jump scare kind of thing and the quick editing, um, and maybe even to a degree the higher content of violence that's sometimes presented in newer horror films. So I don't know, like it's a generational thing too. I think, but I love, there's certain films that I love that are really really gory and over the top. I love a lot of the new stuff. Sometimes I think the quick editing or like say the jump scare can be really effective depending on when it's done. But I think it's probably overused. It's a formula that's been done and done again, so it doesn't have as much of an effect. But so it's a different thing. I think it's an attention span thing too. Why they probably didn't like the film. It wasn't a case of where they it was really a point to where they kind of just dismissed it altogether, and I think it wasn't really fair. I mean, you can like it or not, but you can't. It's hard to dismiss something when you realize that it has its place in history, and you need to like kind of give props to it at least. And I felt like they were not willing to do that, and it wasn't a case of saying whether they liked it or not. It was more just not giving it the respect. But I think too it was also clearly centered on a generational thing where they were used to the newer style of filmmaking for horror films that typically has those tropes of the quick editing, quick violence, or lots of sexual content, and it's all like kind of shoved down your throat pretty quickly as far as the story, and it's not really about the pacing per se. That's I think within the last 10 years there's been a problem with that. There's been some really amazing films and filmmakers that have come out in the last few years, but I think in general it's probably safe to say that the overall style of horror films has changed dramatically to try to appeal to an audience's attention span, which isn't quite there as it used to be. But again, for me, this was one of the going to see Halloween on the big screen was one of the greatest, experiences for me going to the theater, and it just really and I think about that experience a lot because to me, at the end of the day, that's like for me is such an important part to for having an experience like a real experience. Like it feels like going to a concert or an event or like it has that ritualistic aspect. And to me, that's why I am pretty steadfast about people going to theaters and experiencing something, experiencing a piece of art like the way it should be experienced, as opposed to like kind of a dumbed down version of it, which happens, I think, to a degree with various streaming services. And so this will bring me to the the more recent films. Um, like I said, I've seen all of them. There's actually there's actually three films that have come out recently. They've all been directed by this director David Gordon Green, who, as far as I know, he really didn't have any experience before kind of getting the keys to this franchise as a filmmaker. I believe he also mostly had worked on music videos and things like of that nature. And for whatever reason, he was able to get this incredible, huge, you know, deal through Jason Blumhouse, he's a producer who is probably one of the biggest producers in Hollywood right now, and he mostly focuses on horror films, pretty much. And he was really his big score as a producer with, and Jason Blumhouse started Blumhouse Studios. his big break or his big movie was when Jordan Peele's first movie came out, Get Out, and that movie was a huge blockbuster, and that movie was incredibly daring, and it was a I feel a real game changer, and completely and utterly original in every way, and one of the one of the great movies that's like come out in many years. And so, and also David Gordon Green is also in the process, which I believe it's done now. But he's in charge now. Blumhouse is doing a remake of The Exorcist. So so recently I sat through and I watched these two films, Halloween, which came out in 2008, 2018, and then Halloween Kills, which came out a couple of years ago or a year ago. And I was, and I've been wanting to give these movies a chance. I had a lot of mixed feelings when I saw them. So I rented both of them and I watched them back to back. And I was really feeling, I just got this feeling of like fatigue. And I felt really let down by a lot of these films. I felt like they were trying to really pretend that previous films didn't exist, and it got it got marred down with a lot of cooks in the kitchen. I feel like with the writing, they tried to tie up these ends and try to forget about these things that happened in the previous movies. And I feel like in a lot of ways it was like clearly there were aspects of it where they kind of knew what they were doing. They were trying something new, but it wasn't really executed the right way. And it just, going back to the original just so much atmosphere and so much creativity that's on the screen for such a little money. And I felt like that was lacking with these films. It just never really felt like Halloween. It never really felt like it was going to be that real experience. So, and in Halloween Kills, I felt was a little bit better in some ways. Like it obviously does live up to the title. It's very gruesome and brutal. And the same thing, like after the first 20 to 25 minutes, I found myself being pulled into it and I was enjoying it. But I feel because of a lot of these ideas that I thought at times were really good and interesting, and some of the characters, I don't feel like all of this work was handled by people that were skilled enough to really execute and bring these ideas to true like fruition. And I feel like it was just due to a lot of poor execution and just not people that are really. Danny McBride, who is a pretty famous comedian, and he's done lots of movie roles, and he's pretty funny, and I do like him. But he's also has gotten involved with producing, and of all people, he got involved with co-writing this script. And so I just feel like there's too many people involved with the script writing, and not enough people to really have the skill set to really execute these ideas and bring things together and tie things together in a real cohesive way. It's got, I think, shades of where it's pretty interesting and great, particularly around Halloween Kills. I think it has, some really great action sequences. But when it gets into more of the character based scenarios around the film, because of the lack of execution with a lot of these ideas, things I feel really fall flat. The one thing that is cool about Halloween Kills is it does feel like it has more of an atmosphere of where you feel like you're in Halloween and you feel like you're in that environment. Because there are these flashbacks in Halloween Kills from the first one, the very first one in '78. And that sequence and those areas of the film, it's super strong, and you really feel like they transported you to that period. So there's some moments of really great ideas, but again, it's like not really told from. These ideas are being brought forth by people who are not really, I feel, are not skilled enough to really execute these ideas, and to try to, granted, trying to do something new and different, but it it feels like it's undercooked. And after about 35 minutes of Halloween Kills, it becomes lukewarm to me, and I just kind of mentally check out. And it's underwhelming, particularly Halloween, the one that came out in '78. I mean, the one that came out in 2018. Particularly that one. That one's harder to get through because it never really establishes that the environment that you feel this movie needs to be in. So you just don't, in the characters and some of the writing, the directions that they took Jamie Lee Curtis's character, I feel, is kind of modeled off of. I've heard a lot of people talk about it. It's kind of been modeled off of Sarah Connor from the Terminator movies, and she is so revved up as far as being this like survivalist character who's like dealing with all of this trauma, which I think is an interesting idea on paper. I think could be is a cool thing to explore. But the way they do it, the way the writing is for the film or films, it's so like kind of over the top, and and it loses its impact. It's a little bit too heavy handed, and so it almost for me it almost comes across as that the writing is bad, but it almost kind of feels overwhelming and kind of annoying to a point because she's kind of always in this like state of like trying to defend herself and why I'm this way and why this is that way, and it's just you feel like you're being hit over the head. And whereas like in the first one at 78, she's just she's a high school girl who is thrown into the situation or this crazy family because of this family dynamic that she's unaware of, and she's not, so you see these different sides to her, but she's a kid, but there's different sides to her, and at the end she has to like survive and try to save people, but there's like a development. There's a few different shades in her character, whereas the newer version Laura Strode, she is just all 100% kind of in your face with this very aggressive uh, kind of disposition, and it's a little bit hard to take, and it's a little bit. So I felt myself not as great as an actress as she is, and I like the idea of what they're presenting. It's overkill. I feel like it's too much, and I just feel like I'm getting hit over the head with her. There's no subtlety, and I feel like that happens with the other characters in the film, where it loses its momentum. It's not really, it becomes there's so many plot holes. There's so many things that don't add up, and there's so many things that are just from a narrative standpoint, uh, particularly in the one in 2018, but then also in the one that came out last year, Halloween Kills. There's just where the ball they just drop the ball altogether, and there's so many things in the film where there's just these big giant holes, and it for me it you get into it, and then once these things happen where there's obviously these big plot holes and things that are not cohesive anymore, you just kind of check out, and you just you're not invested in it anymore. So it's a pretty mixed bag. There are things about those films that are good, but as a whole, um, they're pretty dismissive. But these movies are just so talked about, and I'm just amazed by how much money they're making. I think on one hand it's good because it's a lot of people are keeping the horror genre alive as far as it making it a financial you know thing that is still viable, and that has a market. But it's amazing that these films still have that, or these films in particular still have that drive, unlike anything I've ever seen. And I'm not very excited about seeing the very last one. So, but again, this goes back to the original, and I'm going to be reviewing a couple of the other films, Halloween 2, which came out, which was the sequel, and also one of my all-time favorites, which I almost, 2 Degrees is almost my favorite film in the franchise, with the exception of John Carpenter's, is Halloween 3, Season of the Witch. So I'll be doing some shows on that. But you cannot beat the classic. Pure atmosphere. Such a masterpiece done for so little money. And just terrific. So this is Jason Dean. And so check out this page if you get a chance. And like and subscribe. And we'll see you next time. And happy Halloween.